everyone, and thank you for being here. So this talk, One Certificate to Rule Them All, is about an investigation that I've been carrying out for 2 years now. And so here, we are going to talk about botnets that involves compromised devices all around the world. And before we dive in, a quick overview of who am I. So I work for Sequoia, which is a French company that provides threat intelligence-driven SOC platform. And this year, we recently became a partner of Flare.io. I work at Sequoia as a CTI analyst in the TDI team, and I'm focusing on tracking state-sponsored like APT threats and their associated infrastructure and malware. Okay, so in this talk, I will first introduce you my starting point. Then we will go down the rabbit hole, where I will detail the elements of the infrastructure that I discovered. And finally, I will make like an attribution. It's more, I found several evidences that leads me to make an hypothesis on the origin of this threat. Okay, so a part of my job consists in open source monitoring, where I have to capitalize on the published reports on internet, including the indicators of compromise mentioned. And all of this data goes into our CTI database in order to protect our clients. In the end of May 2023, the Japan Computer Emergency Response Team published an article on an attack campaign impacting Japanese edge devices. In the article, they expose a malware called GobRAT, which enables the full control of the infected devices and transforming it as an ORB. So very quickly, what is an ORB? It's for operational relay boxes. And the idea is that an operator deploys command and control servers and then compromise devices that are exposed on internet. And generally, these devices are not secure. So it can be like routers, cameras, fridge, any IoT devices. And the goal is to relay an attack from a command and control server to a final victim. So the attacks can be like DDoS attacks, exploit, or just massive scan or proxying traffic to the final victim. And it's really good because it doesn't leave any traces. Because the victim who receives an attack will not know where it comes from. It will only see the IP address of a compromised device. So for years now, we see that ORBs are more and more used. And so this is the investigation that I'm going to present to you. It's concerned one ORB in particular, GobRAT. Okay, back to the article. They give a very good technical description of the malware capabilities. And they even created a command control simulator that they shared on GitHub. So for the malware, I didn't look closer, as it was really perfect good. But for the infrastructure part, they only mention 3 command and control servers. So I began to hunt on these 3, and very fast I saw that all of them use the same certificate, this self-signed certificate. So a first query is to search all the hosts using this certificate on search engines like Census, Shodan, VirusTotal, etc. And by doing this, I found many additional hosts. So I began to analyze all of them on each port or each services, and I noticed that on just one of them, there is a second distinct self-certificate. So for the last 2 years, I've been able to track this infrastructure only using a very basic query based on the hash of these 2 certificates. And this is here we see that the operators have made the mistake of always using the same certificates. This graph shows the numbers of new servers deployed per month, which uses at least one of the 2 certificates. I estimate that the infrastructure has been active since at least 2021, and since 2024, the number of new servers has been rising steadily. In total, it's more like 70 servers, and many of them are still active today. And despite the fact that the query is very basic, I admit it, totally, the infrastructure behind is a little bit more complex. So this is the full picture that I've been able to draw based only on my understanding and the research I made for the last 2 years. I've been able to make like direct links, but I still have some unconfirmed technical hypotheses on certain parts. Okay, so now let's go down the rabbit hole. And I will start with the staging servers. Staging servers consist in an open directory on the path static. It's available on internet without any restrictions, and the goal is to host malicious files so they can be downloaded by any other devices. And first we have the GobRAT malware, but also on every staging servers, we have the Bulbature malware, which is not mentioned by the Japan cert. And we will go deeper on this after. We also have some bash scripts, and sometimes on some of them, there are some tools. In total, I have identified like several hundred different files in the staging servers. And now let's see the infection chain. It's used to compromise the edge devices. So first, we have an operator that deploys staging servers, which are hosting malicious files, as we saw. Then it compromises an edge devices that are running a Linux operating system. So here it can be router, camera, fridge. And once he's inside the devices, he executes some bash script that will retrieve the malicious file. And these files are executed. And what we see is that the bash script really degrades the security. First, it ensures its persistence, it's blocking other potential users, it's making the host publicly accessible by disabling security mechanism, and he's installing the malware. Then both malware are executed, and they start communicating to their own command and control server. Okay, so now let's analyze how the malware are communicating. As we saw, a bash script will retrieve both malware, and the first is GobRAT. And to give you an overview, GobRAT is written in Go and packed with UPX, and it's compatible with the 64-byte and IRM MIPS architecture, and it has classic RAT functionalities, like start or stop a reverse shell, execute shell commands, fingerprint host, etc. But also, some of them are very specific to ORBs, like you can attempt to log in on services like SSH, Telnet, etc. You can send HTTP dictionary attack to specified IP. You can perform DDoS or run a SOX proxy. On the other hand, there is the Bulbature malware, and yeah, it has never been mentioned by the Japan cert or in public, but it has always been present with GobRAT. To give you an overview, it's developed in C, it's compiled just like GobRAT for a 64-byte ARM, MIPS, etc., and it's packed with UPX. It's not yet obvious how Bulbature behaves due to a very high level of obfuscation. And at this time, it has not been possible to identify all its features and network interaction. What we see is that it contains anti-analysis, like control flow flattening. It's stripped and contains more than 1,000 functions. There is an extensive view of async programming, which makes reverse engineering really difficult. And what we see is that it's a malware with functionalities that are primarily network-related, along with other features, such as executing local commands. And when Bulbature is executed, it can be without any arguments. So it first connects to the Bulbature dispenser, which is a server that is designed to send back a list of 3 IP port C2. It then connects to one of the 3 IP ports, and then Bulbature just listens on a random UDP port. And we see that data are exchanged with the C2. There is another way of executing Bulbature. It's with dash and a port. And in this case, it's just listen in UDP to the specified port, and we see that also data are exchanged with the C2. But also, in this case, it listens in TCP on the localhost only on the port 8001. Okay, that's it for the malware interaction. And now that we understand a little bit more about how malware works, let's take a look at the command and control servers. And first, to what I call the proxies provider. These are web servers that have an interface on the port 8080. And what we see is that firstly, there is a login screen, so it can be accessible. However, I found that on the assets path, you can retrieve all the JavaScript files from the server in order to see how it works. And when I analyzed these files, I realized that there was a configuration mistake, as it's possible to view the final interface without being connected. So here is what the interface looks like without having access to the data it contains. And first, we are on the tab called Nodes, which appear to list IP address with their status and current operation. And if we click on the Add button, we see that it's possible to add a remote host by entering its port for VPN, L2P, HTTPS, or even SOCKS. We also see that you are asked whether the deployment has already been carried out or whether it must be done by the server. So this may be a reference to the bash scripts installations seen earlier, but I don't have any technical evidence here. So we can assess that this tab is used to list devices controlled by this interface in real time. Next, there is another tab called Security Tunnel, which appears to list active and inactive connection to IP addresses. And here, if we press the Add button, we see that it's possible to create an on-the-fly connection based on the nodes of the previous tab. So on one hand, we have a list of devices, and on the other hand, we have this tab, and here we can create a tunnel on one or many nodes. So it doesn't seem to be for launching attacks directly, but it's rather as like an anonymous infrastructure that will support infrastructure that will be used to launch attacks. Also, you can see that there are other tabs such as account management, logs, or an interactive world map, but I don't have access to the data, so it's empty. And an interesting tab is the setting tab. We can see that there is a default configuration, and when an operator creates a security tunnel, if he keeps using the same connection for too long, at least 60 minutes here, an alert will prompt on the interface. And this alarm mechanism indicates a desire to rotate the security tunnel as soon as possible. And this is a typical behavior of attackers' groups trying to cover their tracks. So I think that this interface controls the Bulbature malware as well as its dispenser and its C2. But I have not found any technical proof or direct link here between these elements. Okay, now let's take a look at the GobRAT administration interface. So by default, it's a closed, protected interface. And this time, I did not manage to get a real-time view. But with the proxies provider, just as proxies providers, in the asset path, you can find the source code of the front end. So you can reconstruct the interface locally with a little bit of development. So that's what I did. And this is the home page when you are connected to this interface just in localhost. So we just have the interface, so we can explore and see what it's used for, but as for the proxies providers, we don't have the data. So firstly, you land on this dashboard in the Home tab, and we can see a table of data supposed to list IPs with their location, status, type, etc. The data can be filtered using a flags column, which is a criteria that seem to be very specific to operators, where we have TCP, UDP, if the device is routed or not. You can also sort by country. And in the category field, which seems to correspond to the type of device, we can see that we have routers, camera, NAS, Linux, or others. And at the bottom of the page, there is also plenty of functionality for sending shell commands to remote hosts, and here they're called remote host bots. The next tab is for the current tasks. And if you click on Create Tasks, a new window appears offering to create 3 possible tasks. The first is called Weak Password, which appears to be dedicated to credential brute force on services such as SSH, Telnet, MySQL, etc. And it's possible to upload a file that will contain many IP or domains, and you can choose several bots to perform the task. Then there is a tab called Exp, I think here is for exploit, which is dedicated to launching what they call plugins. And here is the creation windows of a plugin. And so this window consists in entering several custom network steps, which can be adapted according to the type of task, and in which you can modify the request header or the content, etc., and validate a web response pattern. So what we see is that the operator has the ability to customize its request and here probably to exploit vulnerabilities, and to save the result if it matches its conditions. And the last tab is for DDoS attack. You can select one or more targets and the number of threads, etc. And you can launch a deferred DDoS campaign and combine this with the plugin we saw just before. So to sum up these tasks, we see that it's a real toolbox for clearly offensive and automated cyber operations. And it corresponds exactly to the GobRAT features described by the Japan CERT in their article. And finally, we have all the weak password results, web admin result, exp result, etc. And you can see that each one has an export function. So up until now, I only had the interface, but without the data. And one day, I asked myself, is it possible to find the data on the server? And guess what? On one server over 70, I found an open directory, and probably due to an incorrect access management, I came across this. So you can see that the name of the files correspond exactly to the tabs we have on the interfaces, like node, weak pass, web admin, etc. And we have the timestamp that correspond to the export dates. So for example here, if I open the largest file called node, we can see that this is 75,000 lines, and each line corresponds to a unique IP. And you see that there is a lot of information, like the type of device, the location, whether it's active, and there's also, for example, the return outputs of bash commands in the column message. So this indicates that they are compromised hosts with which the operator has interacted. And do you remember the interface on page? We can see that it has exactly the same column name. So we can be pretty sure that this is an export of the interface made by the operator. So on one hand, we have the interface without the data, so we can confirm the possible operation. And on the other hand, we have an export of the data, so we know which hosts have been compromised and are being used to relay attack from this infrastructure. This file is really cool because it contains structured data. So one of the first things we can do is to drop a victimology schema. And so based on the location column, here is a distribution of the ORBs over the 75,000 lines. So there are over 100 different countries here, with the United States by far the largest country impacted, followed by Hong Kong and Sweden. So the first assumption we can make is that the operators want to obtain exit nodes on 3 continents, but that there is a particular focus on the United States. Then, based on the flags column and its values, this diagram shows the type of device compromised. And we can see that almost half of them are ORBs that are ARM-based Linux devices with a public IP address. A device was the operator as root access, and which communicates in both TCP and UDP. So this file export allows us to estimate the size and the type of botnet, and honestly, it's quite large. So still with the idea of finding export file, if you remember in the tasks, it's possible to upload a file for IP or domain that are going to be targeted. I also managed to find some of them still on the same server. So I've listed them all for the last 2 years, and here is a list of all the files I've been able to recover with the number of lines that they have. In total, there are over 22 million targets. And based on the file names, you can see that whether they're using a third-party tool, such as FOFA, for exporting an IP address, or they're looking to target specific brands, such as QNAP or Draytech or D-Link, or sometimes on particular services, such as SSH or Telnet. And certain files have country names, such, for example, TWSSH, I think is for Taiwan here. So we can see that there are a lot of targets. So this interface can handle several million operations at the same time. And all of this is what I found on just one server, but there are about like 10 active still today. So just by analyzing the GobRAT administration interface, we can now map out the entire infrastructure chain, and this time with technical evidences. So to sum up, here is my understanding of the infrastructure at the moment. And as you've seen, I still have some missing parts, Still work to be done, particularly on the Bulbature section. And yeah, what I can say is that the infrastructure is still active. Just checked this morning. So now that we have covered all that, we're going to take a look at the question of who might be behind all this infrastructure. First of all, when you look at the TTPs, the compromised edge devices being used to relay an attack, it's really reminiscent of the Chinese ecosystem. At Sequoia, this is something we have already seen, notably on APT31 or for the Quad7 botnet. And so I don't really have any hypothesis about which group is it, because the Chinese ecosystem is quite large, but our first assumption is that, yeah, it's China. Then, when you look at some comments in the bash scripts, they are in Chinese. And in the first version of the proxies provider, in 2023, the interface was only available in Chinese. On the infrastructure side, there is a predominance of Chinese autonomous system for command and control servers, with the Kaopu and Alibaba, and like more than 80% of them are hosted in China. In terms of targeting, we saw that the main victimology of the ORBs was predominantly the United States. And currently, ORBs try to have exit nodes as close as possible to their victims. So this could indicate a real desire to have a stronger targeting in the United States. In May 2024, Mandiant published a report in which they describe an ORB infrastructure in a very similar way, but with a different name. And they give a new acronym for this small part of the operator infrastructure. They call it ACOS, for Adversary Controlled Operation Server. And unfortunately, there is no IOC, so I can't compare and confirm that, yeah, we are talking about the same infrastructure. But they attribute the whole infrastructure to China. And finally, in a publication in January this year, there is an overlap of a command and control of TinyShell, which is a Chinese backdoor, and GobRAT. And it's publicly known that TinyShell is used by several Chinese operators. So all these elements allows me to estimate with a high level of confidence that GobRAT and Bulbature are operated by Chinese operators. And if you remember, in the interface, the account management was possible. And if you add this to the size of the infrastructure, we can also assume that it's used by several groups at the same time. So yeah, it's just my understanding on the information I have for the moment, and maybe tomorrow there will be a new element that will completely change the understanding I have. And if you have any other information, I will be very happy to discuss it with you. Thank you very much for your attention. If we have some time, I can answer fast question, if there is any.